Welcome to Paranormal Northwest, a podcast all about the history and the paranormal of the Pacific Northwest. Join me as I tell stories of this great region, the history, the people who live here, and those who may have never left. So, sorry about the wait for this episode. I have been battling a cold and about a vertigo, which is not fun. But I have had this episode all typed up and ready to go for like 3 weeks. I also have some doggos in the background of this episode, so if you hear some small barking noises or the jingle of their collars, that's what it is. No cat this time, but there are some dogs in the background. So this week, or this episode, we are heading to the interior of the Pacific Northwest, to Idaho, and we are going to be checking out Idaho State Penitentiary. And forewarning, this is probably going to be my longest episode yet. So grab your sweater, your blanket, and a cup of tea, and let's get started. The Old Idaho State Penitentiary is located just east of Boise, Idaho. Boise is both the capital of the state as well as the most populated city in Idaho, with approximately 235,000 people. The city and its surrounding area sits at an elevation of approximately 2,700 feet above sea level. Boise sits in an area of the state also known as Treasure Valley. The Boise Valley was home to the Shoshone and Bannock people for thousands of years prior to European settlement. These two groups were separate but traded together, sometimes wintered together, and even intermarried. For a deeper dive into these two groups, check out my episode on Pocatello High School, which is episode 3. The Treasure Valley area wasn't explored until the Astor Expedition of 1811. This expedition was the initial expedition of John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, the name Astor is synonymous with the fur trade and early Pacific Northwest history. It wasn't until I was in high school that I realized that John Jacob Astor had become such an incredibly wealthy man. Now, anytime I see a reference to Astor in terms of wealth, and particularly within the Golden Age of American society, I am immediately brought back to the fur trade. John Jacob Astor was born on July 17, 1763, near present-day Heidelberg, Germany. At the age of 16, along with one of his brothers, he moved to London. There, he learned English working in his uncle's piano and flute company. He immigrated to the new United States after the American Revolution in 1784. On his journey from London to New York, the young Astor had met a fur trader who regaled him with tales of the West and the furs. While he worked for his brother in a butcher shop, Astor began to purchase raw hides from natives, then prepared them himself and sold them back in London. He began to make a great profit and was able to open his own fur goods shop after only a few short years in the late 1780s. After the 1794 Jay Treaty between the United States and Great Britain, Astor was able to expand his business into even larger markets. He began shipping furs from Montreal to London, quickly amassing a large fortune. If you didn't already know, John Jacob Astor is known as the United States' first millionaire. In 1800, Astor began trading with China. He had already become one of the leading figures in the North American fur trade, if not the leading figure. Astor had agents working throughout North America collecting and acquiring furs. However, tensions between the United States and Great Britain began to rise again in the early 1800s. This led to the U.S. Embargo Act of 1807, which cut off trade with Canada. But by this time, Astor had become not only an incredibly wealthy man, but also an incredibly influential one. He was able to receive permission from then-President Thomas Jefferson to create the American Fur Company on April 6, 1808. This new company rivaled the existing British fur trading companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. At this time in global history, the United States and Great Britain were once again on the brink of war. Tensions were incredibly high throughout North America. Astor was able to capitalize on anti-British sentiment globally. He was able to cut into markets that had previously been controlled by the other British fur trading companies. The tensions came to a boiling point with the War of 1812, and Astor's business came to a halt. He was able to recover after the war, and by the 1830s, Astor and his companies held the monopoly on the North American fur trade. I'm going to hold off on talking too much more about Astor as I have future episodes that involve him as well, but I do want to talk about one of his specific companies a bit more. The Pacific Fur Company was a subsidiary of the American Fur Company. Astor created multiple subsidiaries of the American Fur Company throughout North America. For business purposes, I'm sure this makes sense. The idea with these subsidiaries, as far as I can tell, was to be able to control more areas of the fur trade market. The Pacific Fur Company lasted from 1810 to 1813 and functioned within the Pacific Northwest. It was also funded entirely by Astor himself, in stark contrast to the other fur trading ventures in the region. Astor planned the new venture strategically. There were 2 sets of employees sent to the Pacific Northwest, one overland and one by sea. The overland route followed the same path as the Lewis and Clark expedition from only a few years earlier. The sea route followed the traditional route down the Atlantic coast, around Cape Horn on the southern tip of South America, then up the Pacific coast of South America, Central America, and finally made its way to the Pacific Northwest. The overland portion of the venture passed through the Treasure Valley and Boise area. This group also established a small outpost near the mouth of the Boise and Snake Rivers. This would later lead to the creation of Fort Boise. Fort Boise was actually 2 different forts, Old Fort Boise and New Fort Boise. Old Fort Boise was established at the site of the Pacific Fur Company outpost along the Boise and Snake Rivers. This outpost was initially established in 1813 as part of the Pacific Fur Company expedition. The intent of this outpost was to establish a permanent trading post in the interior Pacific Northwest. At the same time, the other portion of the Pacific Fur Company venture was establishing posts along the coast of the Columbia. The Pacific Fur Company venture only lasted a few years, but the outpost became a stopping point for numerous travelers. As with most of the forts and outposts throughout the West, and I imagine the entire colonial world, the location of the outpost was ideal for both trade and protection. Over the next 20 years, from 1813 to 1834, the site was used intermittently. In 1834, agents from the Hudson's Bay Company, by way of Fort Vancouver, were sent into the interior to establish another fort. Specifically, the chief factor of Fort Vancouver, John McLaughlin, sent his stepson, Thomas McKay, to establish a competing fort to the newly constructed American Fort Hall that was further along the Snake River. Aside from his work establishing the new fort, Thomas McKay was a successful fur trader in his own right. Born in Ontario, he worked the fur trade of the Pacific Northwest with his biological father and was even a member of the Pacific Fur Company's 1811 expedition. He was only 15 years old when his father was killed in a conflict near Vancouver Island. When the Pacific Fur Company venture ended in 1813, McKay joined the Northwest Company, a British fur trade venture. In only a few short years, the Northwest Company was merged with the Hudson's Bay Company. Shortly after the death of his father, McKay's mother married John McLaughlin. However, it wasn't until 1824 that the couple moved to the Pacific Northwest. By that time, though, Thomas had already built a great reputation as a successful fur trader working for the Hudson's Bay Company. McKay participated in the Snake Country Brigades. These brigades were led by the British fur trading entities to trap out the streams of the Pacific Northwest, so that the incoming Americans were unsuccessful in their own fur trade ventures. They were led by Peter Skane Ogden. Many of the traders were, like McKay, either part European or fully European, but with native wives. These men and their families traveled the region, trapping as much as they could. The policy established by the Hudson's Bay Company and Fort Vancouver was to establish a fur desert in the region. This impacted not only the American fur trade, but also the native people of the region. Tensions began to rise throughout the 1820s and early 1830s, when McLaughlin sent McKay to establish Fort Boise in 1834. Now known as Old Fort Boise, the fort was built at the confluence of the Boise and Snake Rivers, the same location of the Pacific Fur Company outpost, which really does make sense, considering that McKay was also part of that venture. McKay named the new fort Snake Fort, both in honor of the river as well as the name that was prevalent among many of the native people of the region. It was shortly, though, renamed to Fort Boise. The American venture at Fort Hall was vacated by the end of 1837, and the Hudson's Bay Company took full control over Fort Boise and the fur trade in the region. By the 1850s, the fur trade had begun to decline, and the fort transitioned to trading primarily salmon. The fort itself was in the Spanish adobe style and was highly susceptible to flooding. Because of this, the old Fort Boise, was abandoned in 1855. By the late 1840s, the United States had a firm grasp on the Pacific Northwest. After the closure of the old Fort Boise, the British were moving out of the region, or more so, just moving north into Canada. A new fort was established by the Americans on July 4, 1863. This new fort was not in the same location as the original old Fort Boise, but was actually 50 miles to the east in present-day Boise. This fort was established at the height of the American Civil War due to the increased violence along the Oregon Trail. It was primarily a military fort to protect the incoming settlers to the region. This new fort continued to be operated until 1919. Backing up a little bit, let's take a look at the region prior to Idaho's statehood. Let's look at just the Idaho Territory. The Idaho Territory was officially organized on March 3rd, 1863 by the United States Congress. The newly formed territory had initially been part of the entirety of the Oregon Territory, as well as the smaller Washington Territory. West of the Continental Divide, also known as the Rocky Mountains, was now the Washington Territory, leaving the remaining eastern portion of the previous Oregon Territory as the new Idaho Territory. This new Idaho Territory actually encompassed all of present-day Idaho as well as Montana, and most of present-day Wyoming. The well-traveled Oregon Trail cut entirely through the territory, which aided in the growth of the region and eventual states. Settlement of this region was also increased and seen as a great alternative to the tumultuous that was caused in the United States after the Civil War. Only a year after the formation of the Idaho Territory, the Montana Territory was organized into its own territory. As the 1860s continued, the Idaho Territory continued to grow, becoming a haven for displaced Confederates from the South. These were the people who fought to leave the United States, fought against the Union, and for slavery. These new Southerners began to integrate into the new territorial government. They soon clashed with the Washington-appointed officials, as in those who had been put into power by Abraham Lincoln and his Congress. In 1866, the current territorial governor was replaced by David W. Ballard. Ballard was born in Indiana, but had moved with his family to the Oregon Territory, specifically to Lynn County in the Willamette Valley. Shortly after Oregon gained statehood in 1859, Ballard was elected to the Oregon State Legislature. Ballard was recommended as the new Idaho Territorial Governor by a fellow Oregon senator, and was officially appointed by President Andrew Johnson in April of 1866. He arrived in the Idaho Territory only 2 months later and found it in complete disarray. The previous governor had moved the capital from Lewiston to Boise, much to the rest of the territorial government's chagrin. Another member of the previous government, the territorial secretary, had embezzled most of the territory's funds while serving as an interim governor. Ballard had supported the federal government during the Civil War and soon clashed with his primarily Southern sympathizing territorial legislature. However, many of the top politicians in the legislature had also come from Oregon. Part of the clashes, though, involved the opposition temporarily removing Ballard from the office. However, he was reinstated and completed his term in 1870. However, 2/3 of the territory voted in a petition to reinstate Ballard as territorial governor, but this petition didn't reach Washington until after a new governor had already been appointed. Ballard left Idaho and returned to Oregon, serving again on the Oregon State Senate. He died in September of 1883 and is buried in the Pioneer Cemetery in Lebanon, Oregon, in Lynn County. The 1870s ushered in a new era in the Idaho Territory. Shortly after the territory was organized, a public school system was created. Only 2 years after organization, by 1865, there were regular newspapers running in the territory. New industry and technology were quickly being built and spread throughout Idaho, as well as the rest of the West. The first telephone call in the Pacific Northwest was placed from Lewiston, Idaho on May 10, 1878. Like the former Confederates, the Idaho Territory also became a haven for the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. Although a burgeoning population in Idaho, the members of the LDS Church were held under suspicion by others in the territory, particularly because of their practice of polygamy. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the Idaho Territory was divided, politically and nearly literally. There were proposals in Congress to section up the territory and return the northern portion back to Washington state, as well as give parts of southern Idaho to Utah and Nevada. Ultimately, though, the Idaho Territory remained intact. Idaho was officially admitted to the Union as the 43rd state on July 3, 1890. The Old Idaho State Penitentiary was initially built in 1872 as the territorial prison. At that time, the prison had 11 prisoners, who were transferred from the Boise County Jail. Over its 101-year occupation, numerous buildings were built on the over 500-acre property. If you have ever visited an historical prison, and I'm assuming modern prisons would also qualify, they are often vast complexes over a large area. The Old Idaho State Penitentiary is no exception, with a multitude of buildings and areas on the property that were used throughout its history. Now, I want to take a bit of a deep dive into the timeline of the buildings of the Old Idaho State Penitentiary, in part to help those listening to better envision just how massive this complex was. But also, I found it incredibly fascinating, and it's my podcast and I can talk about what I want to. So let's take a little bit of a dive. So most of my descriptions I kind of just took verbatim from Wikipedia, actually, because they had everything condensed into one area, but I will kind of ad-lib a little bit. So in 1889, the new cell house was built, and it consisted of 3 tiers of 42 steel cells. The third tier, closest to the Rose Garden, served as death row. The area that is now known as the Rose Garden was once used to execute prisoners by hanging. Of the 10 executions in the Old State Penitentiary, 6 occurred here. An administration building was built in 1893, and that housed the warden's office, the armory, a visitation room, control room, and the turnkey area. In 1894, a false front building, which held a commissary, a dorms, a barber shop, and a hospital, which was originally the blacksmith shop, but was later remodeled in 1912, and then remained the prison hospital until the 1960s. The hospital was converted into the social services office, but was then burned down in the 1971 riots. So in 1898, the dining hall was designed by a prisoner at the time, George Hamilton, and that also burned down in a riot in the 1970s. In 1899, Cell House 2, which was also known as the North Wing, was constructed, and it contained 2-man cells. A honey bucket was placed in each cell to serve as a toilet, which was actually a pretty nice amenity at the time. Inmates burned down the building also in a riot in the 1970s. In 1899, also, Cell House 3 was built in the same style, same layout as Cell House 2. It was eventually condemned for habitation, but in 1921 was converted into a shoe factory. In 1928, this building was remodeled for inmate occupancy and became the first cell house with indoor plumbing. In 1920, the women's ward dormitory was built out of necessity. Prior to its completion, the women moved into the warden's old house in 1905. Previously, women did not have separate quarters, and several scandals forced their relocation. Male inmates built a wall around the old warden's home in 1906 to serve as a separate facility for women. This building had 7 2-person cells, a central day room, kitchen, and bathroom facilities. In 1923, a multi-purpose building was built by inmates, and this served as a shirt factory, a shoe shop, a bakery, a license plate shop, a laundry, a hobby room, a loafing room, which I have no idea what that is, and it also housed the communal showers. Solitary confinement consisted of 2 sections. The first section, which was built in the early 1920s, was the cooler. Although built for solitary confinement, each cell contained 4 to 6 men. The second section, known as Siberia, was built in 1926 and housed 12 3-by-8-foot cells with 1 inmate per cell. In 1952, Cell House number 4 was the largest and most modern cell house at the penitentiary. Some inmates painted their cells and left drawings on the walls that can still be seen today. In 1954, Cell House 5 was built and was a maximum security area where the most unruly and violent offenders stayed. This building also served as a permanent place of solitary confinement. It includes a built-in gallows and death row. Although not a building, there's also an outdoor recreational area that is now the Idaho Botanical Gardens, where inmates boxed and played baseball, basketball, handball, tennis, horseshoe, and football. The baseball and later softball team was named the Outlaws and frequently played teams from across the Treasure Valley. A baseball stadium was located in what is now referred to as Outlaw Field, where the Botanical Gardens host outdoor concerts. The prison cemetery is located in the Botanical Gardens as well. So I really hope that some of the little tidbits about the buildings piqued your interest, such as the nickname of death row being Siberia, as well as my quick and very brief note on the riots that the prison experienced. Don't worry, I will get to all of that. But first, I want to talk about some of the famous inmates who stayed and even died in the penitentiary. And I know this is not a true crime podcast, and I am not glorifying these people or their crimes, but they do have a somewhat lingering aspect in terms of paranormal, which is why I am talking about them. And this was actually very difficult for me to research. I'm a big true crime fan. I listen to all the true crime podcasts and watch all the shows, but it was much different doing the research myself. So there's a reason that I just deal with creepy places. So on to some of these famous inmates. The first is actually a woman, and her name was Lyda Keller, or sometimes known, she sometimes was written as Lydia, but most official documents I found, her name was Lyda. So Lyda Keller was born on October 16th, 1892 in Kettsville, Missouri. The small city in the flatlands of Missouri had a population of approximately 800 people when Lyda was born. Today, it has a population of just about 400 people. Over the course of her 67-year life, Lyda was married 7 times and possibly had many more affairs during her life as well. She married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in 1912 and moved to Idaho Falls. Shortly thereafter, Lyda gave birth to her daughter, Lorraine. Sadly, Lorraine died still as an infant after Lyda claimed she drank contaminated well water. Shortly after Lorraine's death, Robert also died, essentially from food poisoning. Robert's brother Edward, whom the couple lived with, also died shortly thereafter, also of food poisoning. Lyda was luckily able to collect life insurance policies on all 3 after they passed. Now, you may be thinking, oh, poor Lyda, she's so young, so far away from home, and to deal with so much tragedy, but just wait. Lyda married her second husband, William McCaffell, in 1917, and shortly thereafter moved to Montana. On October 1st, 1918, William died of influenza. Lyda was again able to collect on his life insurance. Just 6 months after William's death, Lyda married again, in March of 1919, but by July of that year, she was unfortunately a widow once more. Her 4th marriage, in August of 1920, lasted barely a month before her husband died, supposedly of typhoid fever. I'm sure you may have figured or have a guess as to what was happening. Either Lyda was incredibly unfortunate to have experienced so much continued tragedy in her relatively short life. At this point, she wasn't even 30. Or she had something to do with all the death that was surrounding her. Others began to guess as much. A relative of her first husband became increasingly suspicious of the deaths. With the help of a chemist and the Twin Falls County prosecutor, they were able to exhume the bodies of Lyda's daughter, her first husband, and her brother-in-law. All 3 bodies contained traces of arsenic. Lyda was arrested in Honolulu because she had moved there with her 5th husband in 1920. After a short 6-week trial, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years to life in prison at Old Idaho State Penitentiary. There, she resided in the Women's Ward dormitory. On May 4th, 1931, Lyda escaped prison and made her way to Denver. There, she married again to the man who would then aid in her rearrest and capture. She was returned to Old Idaho State Penitentiary in August of 1931. She was ultimately released in October of 1941, and if being convicted of murder of at least 4 people and released into the general public isn't shocking enough, she was pardoned for her crimes in 1942. Lyda died in Salt Lake City in 1958, a free woman. Our next famous inmate is Harry Orchard. Harry Orchard was born Albert Horsley in Ontario, Canada, on March 18, 1866. He held many titles over the years: son, husband, cheesemaker, milkman, and assassin. Throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, Horsley, who went by many aliases, most famously, though, as Harry Orchard, was involved in labor wars and mining activities in the interior Pacific Northwest, primarily in Idaho. On December 30th, 1905, a bomb went off outside of the home of former Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg, killing him. The city of Caldwell went on lockdown, but many suspected that Orchard/Horsley had been the one to plant the bomb. He was caught only the next day, but denied being the assassin. However, the evidence against Orchard was strong, and he feared the death penalty, which would have meant he would be hung. He confessed to a Pinkerton detective that he was responsible for the assassination. He also, quite casually, confessed to murdering at least 16 other people. Sentenced to life in prison, Orchard was the longest-serving inmate at the state penitentiary. He was imprisoned from March of 1908 until his death, most likely the result of a stroke, in April of 1954. Our next famous inmate is shocking. Well, the next two, very, very shocking. Douglas Van Vleck had kidnapped and murdered his 22-year-old ex-wife, Mildred, in November of 1935. Van Vleck initially pled insanity. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Even though the death sentence was appealed numerous times, Van Vleck was scheduled for execution on December 10, 1937. Prior to his execution, Van Vleck was visited by his parents. As she left, his mother gave him a hug and whispered in his ear. When the guards were distracted, Van Vleck was able to climb up the rafters and jump to his own death, falling 30 feet to the ground. He was pronounced dead about half an hour after his scheduled execution time. The most intriguing, and by intriguing, I mean I would never, ever want to encounter this person, dead or alive, is Raymond Snowden. Raymond Snowden was found guilty of brutally murdering a widowed mother of two who refused his sexual advances. After murdering Cora Dean, Snowden reportedly went to a cigar shop and used the restroom. He also threw the murder weapon, a 2-inch pocket knife, into the gutter beside the store. Snowden was sentenced to death for Cora's murder and scheduled to be executed on October 18, 1957. For months prior to his execution, Snowden was placed in a cell in sight of the gallows he would perish on, knowing his fate the entire time. Come the day of his execution, unlike Van Vleck, Snowden was not able to escape the guards. He was hung as planned. Almost. Unfortunately, his neck did not immediately snap, and he was left hanging by the neck and slowly suffocating to death for an additional 15 minutes while people watched. To this day, people report the sound of someone struggling to breathe in the room. Now I want to get to the riots that I previously mentioned. The summer of 1971 was hot, especially for the Pacific Northwest. On August 9th, temperatures in the Boise area reached 102 degrees. If you're not from the Pacific Northwest, we're not used to heat. Everything starts to melt once it hits 90. The roads, the trees, the bridges, and even the people. We are not made for heat here. The summer of 2021 was the hottest in the region's history, with some areas getting up to 114. Like I said, we melted. So in the summer of 1971, tensions were already high, and the heat didn't help. The cells in the penitentiary are old metal cell blocks. These made the heat outside even hotter inside the buildings. In addition to this, shortly before August 9th, 2 tunnels had been found, and an entire cell block was vacant. This also happened to be the coolest part of the cells. Perhaps bolstered by the rising temperatures, the prisoners rioted, setting fire to the bakery and social services buildings. The riot was quickly squashed, but 2 prisoners were left wounded. The riot did have a bright side, though. It brought to light the deteriorating conditions of the penitentiary. In addition to the heating concerns, the prisoners also complained of poor sanitation, such as the dirty kitchens and even that their water was contaminated with dead rats. Changes were made, which included cleaning and allowing the inmates more time outside when the weather allowed. Only 2 years later, the most infamous riot in the penitentiary's history occurred. In 1972, which I know is only 1 year later, but give me a moment, the new Idaho State Penitentiary was opened nearby, a project that had been started after the declining conditions were first made prevalent in the late 1950s. This new modern facility was already home to some prisoners, but they were moved between the new prison and the old facility for a few years. In early March of 1973, one of these prisoners was moved from the new prison to the clinic at the old facility. When it was time to return the prisoner to the new facility, he refused to go. While the warden and guards were determining how to handle this, a riot broke out in the prison. The prisoners accused the guards of beating prisoners. This time, the prisoners set fires in 4 different buildings, which included the prison chapel, the kitchens and laundry, and even the tailor's shop. Ultimately, nearly 200 prisoners participated in the riot. This led to the speedy move of the remaining 416 prisoners to the new prison, which officially opened on December 3, 1973. The scorch marks from the 1973 riot are still visible at the Old Idaho State Penitentiary. Today, the facility is maintained by the Idaho State Historical Society and was put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1973, just after it closed. I'm going to admit, I didn't expect there to be so much history to this location. From the growth of the region, the process of building and expanding the facility itself, and especially the inmates who inhabited the Old Idaho State Penitentiary, there's also a ton of information I haven't even gotten to. But it's no surprise that there are more than scorch marks on the walls that have remained of its past. In the course of its 101-year history, there were over 13,000 prisoners in the facility. At least 110 of these inmates died in the prison. In all of Idaho history, there have only been 11 state executions, 10 of which were at the Old Idaho State Penitentiary. The location of the gallows in 5 House seems to be the most active today. This is where both Van Vleck and Snowden met their ends. Another area that has an increased amount of paranormal activity is the solitary confinement area, also known as Siberia. Visitors to the facility have reported hearing voices, moans, and even feeling someone touch them in this area. The facility is open to the public for tours and has been since shortly after its closing. Perhaps because there have been so many visitors to the site over the last 50 years, there are numerous stories of paranormal activity. Quite a few paranormal investigations have been conducted at the penitentiary since the 1970s. I watched 2 of them purely as research, the Ghost Adventures episode as well as the Low Files episode. They were both entertaining, but I didn't hear anything new that I wasn't able to find elsewhere. The Old Idaho State Penitentiary is full of a long, complicated history. The impact it had and still holds on the Idaho region continues to have lasting effects on the people of the Pacific Northwest. That's a wrap on the Old Idaho State Penitentiary. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you enjoyed it. It was a bit more history than I was expecting, but definitely a very interesting location. Next time, we're headed to British Columbia, and we are stopping in Victoria. So please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at ParaNWPod. Until next time, bye!